Hello all, and thank you for joining. My name is Daryl, and I'm with a few folks from Microsoft today. We got Vinicius on the call, Cosmos, Amber, Mike, and Subut. In the first 15 minutes, they will give a presentation on AKS on HCI. After that, we take a bunch of time for questions. And we're also going to do live Q&A. You can send in your questions in Teams. And so let's not waste any more time. And handing over the mic to Amber.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Amber Guo. I am a PM on the AKS HCI team. I work primarily on the Windows Admin Center experience for setting up the AKS host, as well as creating the new Kubernetes clusters. I will be doing the first 15 minutes of kind of guiding us through the overview of AKS on HCI. Several folks, if you guys have seen AKS on HCI from Ignite or other events, this is probably going to be things that have been covered before if you've looked at our docs or other things, but hopefully it'll prime some questions from you guys that we can kind of dive into later. And I have a lot of folks from my team who will help answer any questions that you guys may have on where we are right now. With that, Daryl, I'm going to try to steal the screen.
I will help you with that.
1 second. Okay, cool. Can folks see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right. So as I mentioned, we're going to go over Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI. So first of all, what is exactly Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI? For folks who are familiar with Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure, essentially AKS on HCI is trying to bring that experience to your Azure Stack HCI platform that you have in your own data centers. So we have kind of 4 primary things that we're aiming to achieve with this product for our customers to have a consistent experience from on-premise to the cloud when using Kubernetes with Azure. So one of the main things is that we do want to keep our experience consistent with Azure Kubernetes Service. So what might be available in the product, how the product feels and is used by a user, that is a lot of the core components here. Another thing that we're kind of looking at is making sure that, if you do have AKS in Azure and on-premise, that you can have a hybrid experience between AKS in either location. That's really important to kind of ease the experience that everyone has working with, any services they might have on-prem or in the cloud. Additionally, we want this to kind of be a first-class experience for both Linux and Windows containers. There's a lot of applications that can be run in either operating system, and we want that experience to be available both on-premise and in Azure. And additionally, our 4th pillar is to kind of give our customers that guarantee of security and that kind of experience with security on-premise, which is a lot of the reasons why we find that customers want to bring these kinds of services into their own data centers. So here's the video.
I think we lost the sound of Amber there.
I think Amber needs to enable system audio.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for that.
Cool.
Let me see how I can do that, and we can restart that experience. Okay. Would that be in device settings?
Yeah, I think when you start sharing your screen is when you get asked if you want to include system audio. So I would stop sharing and then start sharing again.
Gotcha. Oh, I see it right there. Okay, well, thank you very much. Sorry for the technical difficulties. And let's start that one more time.
I will show you how you can get the value of Kubernetes without the complexity and get a consistent Kubernetes cluster creation experience across both cloud and on-premises. I have a line of business app running an Azure Kubernetes service, and I want to run this on-premises due to compliance requirements or other business reasons. With AKS on Azure Stack HCI, I can now run Kubernetes apps on-premises as easily as I can in the cloud. Let's see how easy it is to set up AKS on Azure Stack HCI and deploy this app. I start by creating an AKS host on Azure Stack HCI. Let's start with this pre-configured Azure Stack HCI cluster that's already in Windows Admin Center. To kick off a host setup, I navigate into the HCI cluster connection and launch the AKS on Azure Stack HCI setup experience. This wizard does everything I need. It checks system prerequisites, allows for AKS host storage and networking configuration, and prompts Azure registration before kicking off install and component setup. In a few simple steps, I now have my own on-premise AKS host environment. The second step is to create a Kubernetes cluster. Whether you deploy on-premise or in Azure, we offer a consistent experience across both Windows Admin Center and in the Azure portal. I enter my connection details, cluster and host information, and primary node pool specifications. I add a worker node pool to host my app on the node pools page. After completing a few other steps, I create the Kubernetes cluster. With AKS on Azure Stack HCI's built-in hybrid capabilities, you can now deploy apps, use Azure services like Azure Monitor, and manage your AKS HCI Kubernetes clusters from the Azure portal. To deploy my app on the AKS HCI Kubernetes cluster, I create a source control configuration that points to the GitHub repository containing my app. Once the deployment completes, I have the same app running in AKS on Azure Stack HCI as in Azure. What you've seen today is how easy it is to get the benefits of Kubernetes while getting a consistent monitoring and deployment experience.
Cool. So that gives you guys an overview of kind of the experience we have with AKS on Azure Stack HCI. You saw a couple of components of the experience that we have end-to-end available, which is being able to run this application after you set up AKS host on and deploy a Kubernetes cluster, as well as being able to kind of manage and work with that application via Azure Arc. And that kind of hints back to the 4 main pillars that we called out before of providing that hybrid experience and that consistent experience between on-premise and the cloud. So there's some questions that folks may have about when exactly is it appropriate to use AKS on Azure Stack HCI. Well, the answer to this is if you have any kind of Windows or Linux containerized apps that you'd like to run on-premise and connected to Azure hybrid services, AKS on Azure Stack HCI is a great place to kind of begin that journey. We have a lot of different experiences around how to work with modernizing existing Windows applications. My teammate, Vinicius, who is on the call, has been championing a lot of experiences in Windows Admin Center, specifically to help with modernizing your Windows applications. And those experiences will help you kind of work with AKS on Azure Stack HCI as well. Additionally, you can work with different new cloud native apps and also still have them run on premises. This is kind of the consistency that you get through Kubernetes and different Kubernetes experiences that may be on-prem or in the cloud. Additionally, there are other opportunities to be able to use AKS on Azure Stack HCI when you want to use Arc-enabled data services or Azure IoT, kind of then again also building out that Azure hybrid experience from on-prem and the cloud. So to kind of deep dive a little bit more into exactly, where does AKS on Azure Stack HCI kind of exist within the huge Microsoft hybrid stack? There are a lot of experiences that you can work with in Azure via the Azure portal or Azure Arc and applications that can kind of run on top of those experiences in Azure. In Azure, there's also data services via Azure Arc through SQL and other experiences. AKS on Azure Stack HCI is kind of in that layer in between, which enables you to build and utilize those Azure Arc data services and applications and benefits of the Azure portal on your Azure Stack HCI infrastructure. Windows Admin Center, which you kind of saw in the video, which is used to deploy many things and kind of manage a lot of your on-premise infrastructure. That experience also extends up to AKS on Azure Stack HCI, as you can see kind of on the left side. So Windows Admin Center is available to kind of help you work with your hardware, as well as work with Azure Stack HCI. And once those experiences are complete, you can work with AKS on Azure Stack HCI as well. Lastly, as an overview of the architecture, so as you've kind of seen through the different experiences in other slides, there's a lot of kind of benefits of using the Azure Arch control plane to be able to work with your Kubernetes clusters on Azure. But AKS on HCI really kind of helps you set up those middle components that can be really difficult to set up on your on-premise infrastructures without kind of an easy experience that we've made available through this product. So what AKS on HCI can kind of help you enable is all of the OSS components, as well as CSI, CNI, Cluster API, and kind of all of those implementations to support that. And additionally, have those different Linux and Windows host environments to help you to work with your workloads. So if you guys have not yet had a chance to work with AKS on Azure Stack HCI, there's a couple of steps to go through to get the public preview bits that we announced at Ignite. First, you need to register and get some more information about kind of our product. You'd be able to then download the different bits required to work with AKS on Azure Stack HCI. And we also have a bunch of different tutorials and guidance on our docs pages that will help you learn and work with this product. So here is another page for resources. And Daryl, I'm not sure if there's a way for us to share this kind of out afterwards, but we can point people to these pages later as well. And with that, I'd like to start into questions.
Cool. Can I ask the first one?
Sure.
Where can people ask questions on AKS on HCI? Can they put it on GitHub, or can they do it on the Microsoft forums?
Yeah, so we are monitoring a GitHub page that is currently where we're taking a lot of our feedback from. I think depending on other issues that you may have, you could also work with other support systems within Microsoft. Folks on the call, if there's other locations that people can go to, feel free to chime in.
And when AKS on HCI goes GA, do we get support through the Azure portal?
Yeah.
We would. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. Once it's GA, support will be handled through the Azure portal for our customers.
Great. All right, I see a lot of questions in the Q&A on questions that are also in the FAQ. So I think let's move on to the FAQ part.
Cool. So there's a couple of questions here. So the first one is, how is AKS on HCI updated? And Mike, if you're on the call, if you'd like to kind of chime in here.
So the update flow is handled through the Cluster API providers as a rolling update. So we will ship every month a new set of VHD images as the base images for the cluster nodes, for the worker and the control plane nodes. And the customer will get a notification in Windows Admin Center, or if they have PowerShell, they can call get AKS HCI updates, and it will download the new images, and they will have something like an apply AKS HCI update PowerShell command, or through WAC they can initiate the update. The rest is orchestrated through the cloud operator in Kubernetes that will drain and isolate each node one after the other, and then a rolling update flow update each worker and control plane node until they're all up to date to the latest version. And yes, it will follow the same release pattern roughly as AKS. On Azure, we are aligning on the Kubernetes versions and on the Windows versions. Where we're not aligning right now is on the Linux versions because they're using Ubuntu and we're using Mariner. That is something that's being worked on over the next semester or two, and then we'll hopefully be able to align on these versions as well.
Cool. Sounds great.
Thank you, Mike. What is the roadmap for AKS on HCI?
So the roadmap is published on the GitHub repo. I will share the link in a second. You can just go there and follow the roadmap and see what we're planning for each of the next monthly public preview releases, as well as what's falling into the GA milestone. And then post GA, we're going to start posting there. We're also going to add our things that we're going to do there. So a couple of big items that we're looking at right now for public preview is VLAN enablement. So you can actually use VLAN tags to segment which was also, I think, a question here on the chat, to segment out clusters. And static IP addresses is another one. Proxy support for deployment and configuration, so that you can use it in an environment that requires a proxy. Those are all things that are going to go into public preview over the next few months. Once we're post GA, we're going to look at things like disconnected support, bare metal support, GPUs, and several big block items amongst smaller things that we're tackling. So take a look at the roadmap and keep us posted. If you have any requirements, just let us know.
Yep, and to also chime into that, if you're looking to see and compare additionally AKS to AKS on HCI, AKS also has a roadmap. So these two can kind of be things to help you look at what's coming in both. The next set of questions are kind of on CRI, CNI, and CSI, which is what, container runtime interface, container network interface, and container storage interface. So first question, will AKS support Microsoft SDN v2 as CNI?
This is one of the items on our roadmap, yes. It's not going to be most likely in GA, but we're looking at that for the next semester, and it's probably going to flow into the semester after that.
Are we able to have a discussion on these, Daryl? Like, can people chime in with additional clarifications around why they're asking the question and stuff?
No, because it's Teams live, so we're delayed like 20 seconds. But you can, of course, chime in on a question and just talk about it, sure.
Okay, thanks.
Mike, if I can chime into that. So you're enabling SDN v2 for AKS. So will it be able to use all the features of SDN, like load balancing?
HCI. So, sorry, for AKS HCI, not for AKS in the cloud.
Right, sorry, AKS HCI. Can we use all the features that is enabled in SDN v2, like firewalling, load balancing, all that kind of stuff?
So the first goal is to integrate with the network controller, the firewall, and the load balancer. Other functionality we will add as we go.
Okay, cool.
Cool. So the second question on this is, how do cluster shared volumes interact with the CSI? And this kind of, I think, is also related to, will HCI support native Kubernetes persistent volumes? I think Subodh or Cosmos, these are ones that you guys can touch on.
Yeah, absolutely. I also invited Manuel, by the way, who's the dev lead on this, to help with some of these. And I discussed this one with him before. Actually, that's where I wanted to really ask, what does that first question mean? Cluster shared volumes interact with the CSI. So the way it works is,
Subodh.
Yeah.
Sorry to jump in. There's some diagrams that it might help to share as part of this. I added them to the appendix of the slides here.
Oh, okay, great.
We can either I can either build this up, or we can just build the whole thing if you want to speak to it. Either way is fine.
Sorry, I haven't looked at the slide. Yeah, why don't you just go ahead and build it?
Okay, yeah. Do I have the ability to share my screen? That might be easiest, or I can just request control.
Yep, request control and feel free.
Okay, cool. So let's see. I don't think I've been granted control.
I haven't seen a prompt. Okay, why don't you share screen? And that would probably work.
Okay, yeah, let me do that. Let me know if you are able to see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So we published a blog last week, which I'll give the link to in a moment, that explains actually exactly how this relationship works between the sort of storage that you have with Azure Stack HCI and how you mount that directly into the file system for containers running in AKS on HCI. So I have just a pair of diagrams here that provide, I guess, a visual for sort of the explanation that I think Subodh was going to provide. So I'll just build this up really quickly. As a sort of review, this is the storage architecture for Azure Stack HCI for a normal virtual machine, right? So for an application running in a VM with no containerization, no Kubernetes in the picture, first of all, you have a set of industry standard OEM servers with a bunch of extra drives. Those servers are running the bare metal operating system for Azure Stack HCI. That sort of is the first piece of this picture, right? Which is your host cluster. Those servers are obviously connected with high-speed networking, at least a single 10 gig connection, typically 2 connections of 25 gig or higher with RDMA, and that's what allows us to create that software-defined storage bus layer where we can actually replicate IOs across the different servers and give like local access to each machine's drives, even though they're just local sort of standard, SATA, SAS, or NVMe drives. Then those drives, of course, are created into a storage pool, where some of the drives provide caching, like the SSDs or whichever ones are fastest, and then some of the drives are used for capacity. So if you're familiar with Azure Stack HCI and you've been following Storage Spaces Direct over the years, you know basically everything that I just said. But it's helpful to establish that this is the foundation, because then you'll see how AKS on HCI builds on this. Now, using the storage that is in this storage pool across all the nodes, Storage Spaces Direct as a technology within Azure Stack HCI creates these virtualized data volumes, right? That's really a storage space with a file system, typically REFS, provisioned on top. And then virtual machines can place their virtual hard disk files, which can be VHDs or VHDXs, into those virtualized data volumes. And because of the cluster shared volume namespace, that virtual machine is actually able to access its files, whether it's running on the same machine as where that volume is mounted, or even if it's running on a different machine, right? And so it can move freely around in the cluster and always access its VHD file, even if it's not on the same node as where the volume is mounted. All right, so in kind of 6 simple parts, that's like the baseline of how storage has worked in Azure Stack HCI for the last few years, just with normal virtual machines. The good news is that how it works with AKS on HCI is strictly additive to this. It builds on that architecture and then adds a few pieces. So here we have sort of a bit of a blank canvas starting from that architecture. And there's a few different virtual machines that we'll have to get into the details of. There's the controller virtual machine for Kubernetes, which is running some Kubernetes infrastructure for our K8s cluster. And then there's a worker node, which is also a virtual machine. That could be running Windows or Linux inside, depending on the type of containers you want to run. And then there's a container runtime, which could be Docker or Containerd. And then there's the kubelet agent tree and other things like that. And then, of course, there can be other virtual machines, either as additional workers in this Kubernetes cluster, or just as virtual machines running other non-containerized apps, right? Because you can absolutely run containerized apps and traditional virtual machines side by side on top of Azure Stack HCI. Okay, so if we want to, actually, and just to complete the picture, there's an agent that AKS places on each of the Azure Stack HCI hosts, which is a process you can see in like get process in PowerShell running on the HCI OS. And then there's also a clustered service, a generic clustered service, which you can see being managed by failover clustering. Okay, so what happens if we want to provision a container which requests persistent storage, right? So we apply a YAML file, we're going to schedule this pod somewhere, and it actually requires a persistent volume claim as part of its definition. So what happens? So Kubernetes running in the controller node obviously detects that this is happening and like, oh, okay, I'm going to need some persistent storage to fulfill this persistent volume claim. To do that, it interacts with a new storage provisioner, a new CSI provisioner that was built by Manuel and Subodh and others on the call today. So, detailed questions, please come at us. That storage provisioner is like automatically set up for you when you deploy AKS on HCI. So it's not anything that you need to go wire up. It's just part of deploying AKS on HCI. What it means, though, is that when that persistent volume claim comes through, it is able to fulfill that claim. It reaches down to the clustered service running on Azure Stack HCI, which routes the call to the agent running on the node where that virtual machine is going to get its storage. And to fulfill the claim for a persistent volume, what is actually set up is a small dynamic VHD file, which can serve as the storage for this persistent volume. That VHD file is attached to the worker node where Kubernetes is going to schedule the pod. And so in this case, it's the worker node that we've sort of drawn in big here, right? That's where the pod's going to go. And so that VHD will be connected to that VM as a disk. It will be discovered inside. It'll be formatted if it's not already. So either with ext4 if it's Linux or with NTFS if it's Windows. And then that disk inside of that worker node will get mounted into the container file system so that when that pod gets scheduled, all of this is happening very quickly, right? When that scheduling completes, that pod will discover that it can place files in persistent storage at whatever file path it was expecting. So /storage or /app or whatever location in its container file system it wanted to place things, it can now do so. And where that is actually being stored is in this VHD file that has been placed on Azure Stack HCI. So hopefully I did that justice. It was a little bit accelerated, but if you're interested in how this works at kind of this sort of level, we did publish a blog, like I mentioned just a few days ago, that actually walks through this from start to end. It talks about deploying a basic application, scaling that application, and it specifically focuses on how this all allows you to mount storage spaces direct capacity directly into containers. So I will hand it back to Subodh now with this. Subodh, do you want to add things with this diagram up?
I think you covered it all. Great, Cosmos. So yeah, that is a great explanation. I just wanted to know if there's any further questions or if there's anything that we haven't covered already.
Yeah, so I'm curious if one VHDX file is only connected to one pod, right? So it's only connected to one VM?
Yes.
So you would never have a shared VHDX or something?
No, so there could be multiple VHDX files that are connected to a single VM because that's a worker node, because you could have multiple pods running on that node, right? But we take one VHDX, there's a one-to-one mapping between a pod and a VHDX, so you can only mount one at a time.
Yeah, so in Kubernetes, there's a concept of read-write once and read-write many access for, and that's, I believe, defined on a persistent volume claim. So when you initiate a PVC, you say, I need, one pod on one worker to be able to access this, or multiple pods on multiple workers to be able to simultaneously access it. And with the initial preview of AKS on HCI, the storage provisioner only is able to fulfill read-write once requests.
Right.
So
exactly.
There's not sharing, but I believe that is on our roadmap, right, Subodh?
Yes, we are going to support read-write many as well, and that would most likely come through SMB and NFS, file shares. Not shared VHDX. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is the diagram for this first storage provisioner, which you can see is named, aptly as the MSVHD CSI provisioner, right? So that's the only one that gets installed by default when you deploy AKS and HCI, but there will very likely be additional provisioners in the future.
Right. So and we can run VMs next to the worker nodes, which are also VMs, right? Is there anything we need to keep in mind when doing like maintenance on the physical host? Can we live migrate, for example, a worker node?
Yeah, you can live migrate a worker node. It's actually, as far as I know, the placement is completely managed by failover clustering. Mike or others can correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, the worker nodes are not off limits to you. I mean, you don't really need to, you have no reason at all to log into them, but they are otherwise a virtual machine that can coexist with other virtual machines on your HCI.
Yeah, that's correct. There's no issue coexisting other than resource contention at some point probably, but that is up to the customer to determine. And yeah, as Cosmos said, there shouldn't be a need to log into them at any point in time, but they're just other VMs. And if the cluster cluster controller decides to move a VM from one node to the other, the AKS HCI system catches up with that within a few seconds.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
and just speaking from experience, like I have my HCI cluster here in my house. I had a bunch of virtual machines on it before, like prior to the AKS preview. And then I added the AKS preview to it. I did not need to like reconfigure my whole cluster. It's just a couple of additional virtual machines. And as you saw, the architecture is like strictly additive. And that's actually a really important thing because it means that all the features that you might know and like about how storage works on Azure Stack HCI, like the fact that it supports BitLocker encryption, the fact that there's nested resiliency for a 2-node cluster, the fact that there's read-write, server-side caching where NVMe can accelerate hard disks, like all of those things that you know and like about storage spaces direct as a technology accrue to these containerized applications too. So like because it's just a VHD file sitting on the same architecture the rest of the way down from a storage perspective, you can take advantage of all of those same features with containers just like you could with apps that weren't containerized.
Right. So a question from the audience, Ernie, actually. Can we, so
Hi, Ernie.
with cluster shared volumes, we have the ability to define, to be a mirror or parity. Can we specify on which volume the VHDX lens that is used by the pod?
Yeah, actually, it's a really great question. And this is one of the, I guess, like very previewy things about the AKS on HCI preview. This entire picture is happening in the context of a single CSV. So as far as I know, there's no ability right now for us to like straddle the persistent volume claims of multiple pods across multiple CSVs. You just indicate a single CSV at the time you set up AKS in the first place. I'm actually not sure what our plan is for like the timeline to ameliorate that. I don't know if Mike or someone else wants to chime in.
Actually, so you can create multiple storage classes if you want to indicate different CSVs, or if you want to use different kinds of CSVs, for various purposes, right? So that's what storage classes provide. It's still the same provisioner, but you can point it to different kinds of CSVs based on your, like silver, bronze, gold, platinum storage sort of a thing, right? So if you want to do that, that would be one way to do that.
Oh, that's a clever solution. I hadn't thought of that because by default there's a single storage class called default, which means that like if you have a containerized app from say AKS in Azure, and you want to move it onto HCI, it can successfully request storage without actually knowing anything about HCI. It just says I want a gigabyte of default storage, please, and you get it from that default storage class that's there. But you're saying if you define different storage classes, you can actually use that to map to different CSVs underneath?
Yeah, exactly. So that's up to the admin to define multiple storage classes. By default, the deployment just deploys one storage class, but that doesn't mean that you have to limit yourself to that. You can add more storage classes. And if you have different kinds of CSV volumes, as an admin, you would know that you can create multiple classes, and then your developers can come in and point to that storage class for a particular PVC. And that would give them different kinds of storages.
Oh, that's great.
And just to make the analogy, because that's a very clever way to address the multi-CSV thing. As the analogy, if you've ever deployed an application to an AKS cluster in Azure and then done like kubectl get SC, so you've seen the storage classes, there are multiple set up for you by default. Like there's Azure Disk has Azure Disk Premium and Azure Disk Standard, and both of those are storage classes that AKS sets up for you through the Azure Disk CSI provisioner. And so today there's only a single class on HCI, but as Subodh points out, you can actually configure multiple either to reflect different underlying media if you have that, or even in absence of that, I guess you could use it as a bit of a trick to straddle across different CSVs.
I'm happy that you learned also something today, Cosmos.
I did. I had not thought of that.
Cool. Okay. I think we should move on for time's sake.
For sure.
I think you own the slides still, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the diagram that I saw that question come through ahead of time because I know you did that survey, and the CSI question was like, okay, we should make a picture for this. But yeah, I mean, I'll paste the link to this into the chat if it hasn't already been. But if anyone is interested in sort of the nuances of this, like what does it actually look like? How can I go through the exercise of seeing storage spaces, direct capacity get mounted up into a pod. We have a blog that's like just for that. It includes a bunch of different examples, and so I'll paste the link for that.
Great. Was this the last question? I think there was one more question, right? In slides or not?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just see. I'll stop presenting here, and we can go back to the questions.
Okay. I will present my screen if Teams allows me to. Yes, you can see my screen, right?
Yep, I see AKS questions.
Cool. So we went through a lot of these already. The last one I didn't see on your slide was this one. How do we manage AKS worker cluster nodes, and can we do the full management from Azure and not be able to leverage local tools like WAC?
So I'll let Mike or someone address that. And I think there's a difference between not being able to use local tools versus not leading local tools. And the question here is, can I get away with them leading them?
Yeah, so full management out of Azure is something that we're targeting for GA. At this point, the schedules and resourcing between Azure Arc that actually implements that change and our engineering side does not quite align, and we're working on improving on that. So we will see if it makes it to the GA time slot, that it will be fully manageable without any local tools. But most of the day 0 and day 2 operations should be possible if everything goes as planned at GA time. The question, how do we manage AKS worker clusters? Not quite sure what that entails, but I'll give it a shot. So if you're thinking about updating, scaling up, scaling down, that can be done from Windows Admin Center, PowerShell, or through kubectl with a respective YAML file, or even out of the Azure portal when the Azure Arc integration is completed. Everything else is just standard Kubernetes management. So you can deploy tools like Prometheus. You can deploy Grafana for logging and monitoring. You can use any other Kubernetes based management tool set that you feel like to actually manage that cluster and the applications running within.
Cool. I think that answers it.
Yeah, one small kind of comment is for the management via WAC or Windows Admin Center. That work is kind of coming. So our first available experience through public preview 1 has been the kind of deployment experience of the AKS host and creation of the new Kubernetes clusters. It's on the roadmap for us to be able to have that reconnect experience, to be able to kind of peer into that AKS host and those Kubernetes clusters that were created, as Mike kind of mentioned. But that's on the roadmap, so not there yet, but we'll be there by GA.
Okay, cool.
Now, speaking of using local tools, I think Vinicius had something he wanted to mention. It would now be a good time to do that.
I'm down.
Sure. Thanks for bringing that up, Cosmos. Great point. So maybe for this audience, I see a lot of questions regarding the management of Azure Stack HCI and storage specifically. You can think about Kubernetes overall and AKS on HCI, just like any virtualization platform, right? At the end of the day, you're going to put workloads on top of your virtualization platform, in this case, Kubernetes. And then you need to run those workloads. You need to deploy those applications and so on. One of the things specifically for Windows admins is that we are seeing a lot of customers questioning about the process of containerizing their applications, how to build a Docker file, how to build a YAML file, and so on and so on. So we've been working on tooling for that process, for taking your existing Windows application containerizing that application, and then deploying to either AKS or AKS HCI. The first iteration of that is available today in the containers extension on Windows Admin Center. So if you have a Windows Admin Center deployment, you target a server and you have the containers extension installed, you'll be able to see all the functionality to create a new container image based on the source for your application. So if you have a Visual Studio solution from your developer, or if you have a web deploy, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. If you have a web deploy zip file that was used to extract the application from the running server, you can use the tooling that you are seeing here to create a new container image for you. And then from that, at this point today, what we have is you can push that container image into Azure Container Registry, and then you can run that on your Azure service of preference. We have much more to come in the future. We are working on building new types.
I think we lost Vinicius's audio.
I think so as well.
Sorry, I guess I dropped for a moment. I'm back. Can you guys hear me?
Working
Yes.
on building new types, ...
Yep, new types of applications that you can containerize, and also integrating with AKS and AKS HCI. So if you are interested on this, go to the Windows Admin Center extensions page, check the containers extension, let us know if you have a question on this, and you will have my Twitter handle there, and you can contact me directly.
And by the way, let me just say, this is like extremely approachable compared to the alternative. So when I was playing with AKS, like my experience of taking my application, containerizing it, and then pushing it up into an Azure Container Registry so that I could pull it back down onto AKS and HCI, like that was completely me sitting in like Bash on the Windows subsystem for Linux, which compared to this was like not nearly as approachable. So this is really, really good stuff.
Yeah, looks cool. Thanks, Vinicius, for that. I think we head on over now to the HCI part. Let me share my screen again. Yes. A question from the audience. Self-service portal for Azure HCI. So I think he or she is targeting what is called again, Windows Azure Pack of some sort. But we're getting that in Azure, so that's, I think, it's answered. But for the multi-tenancy for service providers, can you chime into that, Cosmos?
Yeah. So I'm happy to field this question. But actually, there's one sort of theme. Sorry if you don't mind, Daryl, that is popping in a few different questions we've gotten in the Q&A on the AKS subject. So I think it's worth going back and just doing this one theme because it seems like it's a question a lot of folks have, and then we'll come back to this if you don't mind.
Yep, go ahead.
The question sort of boils down to, okay, if I have a bunch of containerized applications that are running across one or multiple Kubernetes clusters on top of Azure Stack HCI, like that's great, right? Because that means I can actually run all the different apps that my organization has today and tomorrow, not just the ones that are packaged up to run in virtual machines. Fine. How do I control resource allocation between these, especially in a scenario where they're coexisting with traditional virtualized apps, right? So I've got a SQL server, I've got a domain controller, I've got a print server, I've got a bunch of file servers, I've got all the different things that run in virtual machines today. And now it's tomorrow and I'm starting to put out some applications that are actually running on Kubernetes on the same HCI cluster. How are they going to contend for IOPS, for example, or for storage capacity? And how do I control that? So the short answer is in the preview, again, it's a preview. So there's not really anything built in for that other than just you keeping an eye on it. But I think Subodh can maybe describe some of the plans because there's a whole roadmap around this, and Kubernetes has a bunch of concepts established for how this should work. Subodh, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a concept called storage quas in Kubernetes where you can provide quality of service limits and reservations for your persistent volumes. So you can use that to manage IOPS for AKS, like for Kubernetes clusters for AKS HCI, right? With regards to contention across other VMs and other workloads, I think you'll have to use existing tooling to Not sure if what do we recommend today, Cosmos? Like generally for VMs, right? Because end of the day,
you can use the storage class limitations that are built into Hyper-V, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a great insight for us to see the number of questions that we've gotten actually on that general subject. So more to come, as Subodh said, in terms of like cost limits within Kubernetes themselves, and then that alone is actually sort of sufficient, because if you're quasing every pod or every PV that you're creating, then you can cap how much resources it will request. But if there's a need for a more unified management experience, that's a good insight too.
Yeah. I mean, mostly it's. I mean, think of AKS HCI as yet another workload on HCI, right? So it's not much different from that standpoint. Within that workload, we have a way to manage quas, as I said, at the Kubernetes layer. But as an admin, you could also choose to manage quas at CSV layer or at networking layer, or like there's there's ways you do that today, I'm sure, for existing VM infra, right? So that doesn't go away. I think those best practices would still apply. Think of this as yet another workload, basically.
Yeah, and actually that's a really great point, I think, that you make, Subodh. Like almost everyone listening in today, right, like knows how to deploy a domain controller because their organization has needed that at some point in the past. And you know how to deploy a SQL server, presumably on Windows, maybe on Linux, in a virtual machine, because your organization has required that in the past. It is very, very likely that at some point in the future, your organization is going to want to deploy an application which expects to be run in containers managed by Kubernetes. And that is just another workload, like you say, that runs alongside those other ones. And it's sort of the next thing that we all need to get very comfortable running on top of HCI.
Sounds great. I think that answered the question, the broad topic.
So do you want to come back to this
yes,
self-service?
We've got like
question?
10 minutes left, so we need quick answers, Cosmos.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
So the short answer is our team is working very hard actually on many different aspects of this self-service on top of Azure Stack HCI scenario. It is one of the top handful of things that we get asked about all the time. Is like, can I delegate access to someone else within my organization so that they can create a VM, but they can't screw up HCI itself? Right? They can deploy a virtual machine, but they're unable to go in and accidentally reboot all the hosts. Right? That's basically the gist of the request. And so that is a scenario that we will be delivering on HCI. We showed an early sneak peek of some of the screenshots of that during Inspire, and it's something that we're committed to doing. You'll be able to get your hands on it in a couple of months. Our focus really, though, is on that sort of departmental scenario within an enterprise first and foremost. Where that will take us after that, I can't say. It sort of depends on the feedback that we get. But right now, our goal is really what I said. It's to enable you to give somebody else in your company permission to create a VM, but not otherwise to screw up the cluster.
Right. So multi-department, yes. Multi-tenancy for certified, not sure yet.
Yeah, certainly not in the near term. That's not something you'll see like in 2021, for example. Okay. The second part.
Any new features in the Azure HCI 20H2 build?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as we talked about at Microsoft Inspire, there's a lot in Azure Stack HCI. Part of it is operating system level features that affect the infrastructure itself. A lot of it has to do with cloud-based management, cloud-based monitoring, integration with other tools, things like that. So from the perspective of the operating system itself, I think what you have here are probably the two biggest features in the initial version, right? So Azure Stack HCI version 20H2 is the operating system that's in preview right now that'll go GA pretty soon. And yeah, I think the two biggest OS level features, obviously there are many others, right? There's all the improvements we've been making to the out-of-box experience, like where sconfig launches by default and you can't, like if you close it, it reopens again. And when you go to a shell, it actually launches PowerShell, not CMD. Like there's a long list of little things, but I think you have the two big ones here.
Okay.
An important point though that I will make, if you don't mind, is Azure Stack HCI is an always up-to-date subscription service. And so the number of like big features here, the two that you have listed, is the lowest that this number will ever be, right? It's just going to become a longer and longer list, and everybody who subscribes to this comes along for the ride. And so you don't, and actually this is a really important point, you don't buy Azure Stack HCI 20H2. That's like not a thing that is possible. You can't do it. You subscribe to Azure Stack HCI. This is the current version. there will be a steady stream of features over time. You'll see the first ones in just a couple of months. And so I think that's important in terms of framing this discussion. Nobody has to decide whether 20H2 is right for them. I mean, you just subscribe to Azure Stack HCI and you'll get all the features our team works on, going forward.
Yeah, that's awesome. Looking forward to that. Anything to share on storage replica, maybe?
Oh, I know what you're asking about, but not yet. Don't worry, we'll have good news, but not yet.
Cool. What about this one?
Aha, I'm going to have to dodge that one the same as I did for the storage replica. So this is, we think, a very compelling scenario. We're seeing a ton of uptake on Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure. It's, I think I can say it's one of our fastest growing services. It's extremely popular, especially given what a strange year we've had in 2020. And so we, I personally think it makes a ton of sense for us to look at bringing this to Azure Stack HCI, but we have nothing to announce right now.
Cool. I actually created a user voice myself yesterday because I thought it wasn't there, but it's somewhere in there. But you can vote for this, and hopefully engineering and management will see it, because I think it will open up a broad use case.
Yep, and actually, just to your point about engineering and management, we treat user voice very, very seriously. So we have pretty much every user voice that I'm aware of, whether it's the one for Teams or the one for WVD or the one for Azure Stack HCI, we check it multiple times a week, and we, when there's suggestions, we sort of convene a group of people and we say, okay, what should we do about this? Should we put this on the roadmap? Already on the roadmap? Like, is there a reason it's a bad idea? Like, so absolutely, if this is something you feel is important, make yourself heard on user voice, because we take it very seriously.
And I know we shared a lot of links on this presentation. I will make sure that everyone gets all the links in a separate email, so you can just click on it. If I have a 2-node Azure Stack HCI cluster running, can I add 2 other nodes and make it stretched, or do I need to start with 4 nodes if I want to use stretching?
Yeah, this is a great question. So you don't need to start with it stretched up front. So we have been building the experiences for both the scenario where you stretch it during deployment. That's possible today. If you go through the workflow in Admin Center and you say, hey, I want to stretch this, then it will stretch for you. You can also take an existing cluster and then create a set of sites, and then when you start adding nodes, as soon as you add, I believe it's 2 nodes into a new site, actually Storage Spaces Direct will automatically provision the new storage pool and everything else for you. So we are designing around both of them. The most common one by far is for people to plan this up front. Like generally the perception I've gotten from talking with a lot of customers is that knowing that it's possible is reassuring. Like knowing that you could add DR later is good, but most people, because there's a fair amount of, like, DR is not, no matter what anyone tells you, it's not totally push button, right? You need to figure out how the networking is going to work when the VM fails over, and like there's considerations. And so typically a stretch cluster is kind of planned up front. And that is definitely the more common case that we see, but you can totally add stretch later. It all works just fine, and we test it too.
Cool. I think this is the last official question, and I think it was a great one. So cluster sets on Windows Server versus Azure Stack HCI. So what are the plans for multi-cluster management, and do we get fault domains on cluster basis? So, I mean, cluster sets have this concept of availability sets, like Azure has. Are you planning something for Azure Stack HCI so you can span an application over 2 Azure Stack HCI instances, or maybe even 2 AKS on Azure Stack HCI instances?
Actually, I love this question. This is a little, this is very thoughtful. So I'll give a 2-part answer if you don't mind, since I feel like I'm allowed to do that because there's 2 question marks on the slide. So first one, what are the plans for multi-cluster management for Azure Stack HCI? It's a great question. It's something our team is working on. So we, I think we gave some hints about this. One of the, in addition to VM self-service, one of the top things that we hear from customers is like, WAC is awesome for managing my HCI cluster. It becomes less and less awesome the more clusters I have, because I have to sort of log in interactively to each one just to check status. I would love to see an aggregate view where if I have 10 clusters, I can see them all in the Azure portal. And so that's absolutely something that we plan to show off pretty soon. We didn't do demos of it during Inspire, but we did talk about it a little. And so that kind of multi-cluster, maybe monitoring would be a more accurate term, multi-cluster monitoring, is something that you'll be able to see pretty soon. So that's the first part. The second part about, like, if I go to the Azure portal and I create a VM and I place it on my HCI cluster, but I want to actually indicate that it should be an availability set with another copy of that VM sitting in a different HCI cluster. That's actually very interesting. Nothing to share on that, but if it's something that you feel is valuable, and this is addressed not so much back at Daryl, but at everyone who's tuned in today, let us know. Vote for that on user voice. Let us know if this is something that you need, a concept of availability sets spanning multiple clusters on HCI. It's not something I've really heard much about before, but certainly it makes architectural sense. So let us know.
Cool. So does Azure Stack HCI have a dedicated user voice?
It does actually, and we can add that to the long list of links that we share out. Yes, there's a dedicated user voice and a dedicated section of Azure Q&A as well.
Nice. Wow, 1 minute on the clock left. I mean, Q&A is open. If you have a burning question, ask now.
Yeah, and I think we can, at least I'll try to make sure that if there's a question that comes in the next minute or two, we can answer them in the live event Q&A. But this has been awesome. We've gotten more than 30 questions already. So thank you so much to everybody for this engagement. This is always a lot of fun to get to chat with the community. I know it's a little weird because, to make live events scale, it's kind of one-sided. We can talk, but you can't. But hopefully we were able to get you the answers that you need. Hopefully you learned something. And as Daryl said, we'll have to share out these links because there's been a lot that's happened, whether it was at Inspire this summer or Ignite this fall. And it's not, I think, been as easy for folks to sort of make sure they stay on top of all of it. Like, it's easy to miss something in this kind of strange year we're having. So we'll make sure we share those links so that you can all get caught up.
Definitely. One more question I would like to answer is from Robert.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to run Azure HCI as a lab test staging, but he doesn't want to have the bill. He doesn't want to be charged. You can recycle the cluster, right? Every 30 days.
It's a great question. So there's a little bit of nuance here. So the mainstream answer to this question is that Azure Stack HCI, when you create a new cluster, actually, first of all, I should say it's free during the preview, but I think everyone already knows that. Once we go to GA, it will no longer be free, right? So everyone who currently has an active cluster, you'll get one of those emails from Azure that says, hey, there are changes to one of the services you use. You'll see that pretty soon. And then we'll switch to full price. When we do, the way that will work is when you create a new cluster, the first 30 days are not billed. Those are considered like a 30-day trial or whatever. That's pretty common across Azure services. If you go look at, say, Azure Site Recovery, it works the same way. First 30 days is free. That 30 days is based on us recognizing actually hardware identifiers from the machines that comprise the cluster. So if you destroy the cluster and then recreate on the exact same hardware machines over and over and over, you're not going to get a 30-day trial over and over and over. There is, however, a loophole, which is great for testing purposes, let me tell you from experience, and that is using virtual machines, because every time you create a new VM, it gets a new hardware identifier. And so that's obviously not a good way to run HCI in production, but if you're just looking to have a home lab and click around in Admin Center and run the commandlets and familiarize yourself with the tech, using virtual machines, recreating the cluster every 30 days will give you essentially 30-day trials over and over.
I think that answers the question. Thanks, Cosmos. I think we're over time, so I'm going to put an end to this. I just want to thank the whole Microsoft team for answering all the questions. It was great for me. I was new to Kubernetes as well, so we can continue, of course, the discussions on Slack. You can join Slack. And I just want to thank everyone for joining, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you for hosting, Daryl. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Daryl, especially. This was great.
Thanks.